There are places where hope sounds almost silent. A waiting room before sunrise. The soft movement of nurses beyond a closed door. A family speaking in low voices because they are tired. Because they are afraid, and because they have been told that something extraordinary may still be possible. In the center of this story, there was a promise, not a simple promise, not the kind anyone could write down neatly and fully understand. It was a promise made with the language of science, medicine, innovation, and rescue. It was the promise that a failing airway, one of the most basic passages between life and the world, might be replaced. It was the promise that the body could accept something new, something built outside itself, something shaped by human hands and softened by the patient's own cells. For people facing frightening illness, those words could sound like light. They could sound like time. They could sound like a way home. The doctor at the center of that promise moved through elite hospitals and international conferences with the confidence of a man who seemed to belong there. He was described as pioneering. He appeared in news features. He spoke about the future of regenerative medicine as if the future had already arrived. But behind the polished announcements and hopeful interviews, other voices began to gather. Doctors who watched patients decline, researchers who read the papers closely, colleagues who said that what was written in the journals did not match what they had seen in the wards. And slowly, quietly at first, a different story began to emerge. It was not only a story about one surgeon. It was a story about what can happen when institutions want a miracle badly enough to overlook warning signs. It was about the danger of charisma in a place where doubt is supposed to be a safeguard. It was about patients who placed their trust in medicine at the most vulnerable moments of their lives. And it was about a question that would echo long after the operating rooms went quiet. When a doctor promises the future, who makes sure the patient is still protected in the present? Welcome back. Tonight, we're going to move gently through a true story that begins in the world of advanced medicine and ends in courtrooms, retractions, public inquiries, and grief. This is a calm, true crime story for sleep, told with care and without graphic detail. There will be no sudden sounds, no dramatized shocks, and no exaggerated darkness. We will stay close to the documented facts, while remembering that behind every report, every medical paper, and every legal finding, there were real people and real families. The case is known today through documentaries and articles as the story of Paolo Macchiarini, the surgeon associated with artificial trachea transplants and the scandal that shook Karolinska Institutet in Sweden. But we will begin before the scandal had a name. We will begin in the space between hope and certainty, where the story first became possible. Paolo Macchiarini was born in Switzerland and educated in medicine in Italy. Over time, he built a career as a thoracic surgeon, working in a field that deals with some of the most delicate structures in the human body. The chest, the lungs, the airways, and the passage of breath itself. By the late 2000s, he had become associated with a branch of medicine that seemed to carry enormous promise. Regenerative medicine. The phrase itself feels calm and hopeful. It suggests repair rather than replacement. It suggests a future where damaged organs might be grown, restored, or rebuilt. In theory, regenerative medicine could help solve some of the most difficult problems in transplant surgery. Donor organs are scarce. Rejection is dangerous. Patients can wait months or years for a match. Sometimes there is no match at all. So the dream was powerful. What if a patient's own cells could be used to make the body accept a new structure? What if a damaged airway could be replaced with a scaffold, a framework seeded with cells, and then implanted as if it were becoming part of the person? That was the world in which Macchiarini rose. He was not unknown. He had worked in different countries and became linked to groundbreaking procedures involving the trachea, the windpipe. One earlier procedure in Spain involved a donor trachea that had been stripped of donor cells and then seeded with the patient's own cells. That case received major attention and was presented as a milestone. For hospitals and universities, this was the kind of work that could bring prestige. It could attract funding, talent, and attention. It could place an institution at the leading edge of medicine. And few institutions carried more prestige than Karolinska Institutet in Sweden. Karolinska is one of the world's most famous medical universities. It is also connected, through the Nobel Assembly at Karolinska Institutet, to the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. That connection gave the institution a rare symbolic weight. To work there was to stand near one of medicine's most respected stages. In 2010, Karolinska Institutet recruited Paolo Macchiarini as a visiting professor. At the same time, he also worked with Karolinska University Hospital, where patients would later undergo synthetic trachea transplants. The central idea was startling. Instead of using a donor trachea, Macchiarini and his collaborators pursued synthetic scaffolds. These were artificial structures, shaped like windpipes, intended to be seeded with stem cells or other cells from the patient. In public presentations, the concept was often described in optimistic terms. The synthetic organ would not depend on a donor. It could be customized. It might avoid rejection. It might open the door to a new era of transplant surgery, to a patient with a life-threatening airway condition. Such an idea could feel like the only open door. And that is one of the most important things to remember as we move through the story. The patients were not abstract examples in a scientific debate. They were people facing terrifying medical circumstances. Some were very ill. Some had been told that conventional options were limited. Some were searching, with their families, for any credible path toward survival. One of the patients was a young man named Andamariam Teklesenbet Beyene. He was originally from Eritrea and was living in Iceland as a student. He had cancer affecting his airway. His case would become one of the best-known examples of the synthetic trachea work. After his operation in Sweden in 2011, the procedure was reported internationally as a breakthrough. Articles described the transplant in glowing terms. There was talk of a world first, of a custom-made artificial windpipe and of a patient whose own cells had been used to help create a living replacement. Another patient was Christopher Lyles, often called Chris. He was an American man from Maryland who was also treated in Sweden. He had cancer and sought help after other options appeared limited. A third patient in Sweden was Yesim Ketia, a young woman from Turkey. Her case was different in important ways. She had suffered damage to her airway following a medical procedure, and her situation became deeply complicated. She would undergo a synthetic trachea transplant and later endure years of suffering and additional care. There was also a child, Hannah Warren, who received a similar type of transplant in the United States in 2013. She was born without a trachea, a rare and severe condition. Her case was widely covered with hopeful headlines. She died later that year. These names are spoken here with care. They are not plot points. They were people. And their families entered this story through the most human of all doors, the wish to keep someone alive. At first, the public story surrounding Macchiarini was one of daring innovation. News accounts presented him as a medical pioneer. Scientific articles described progress. Institutions repeated language of promise. In the outside world, and sometimes even inside the medical world. The difference between experimental hope and proven treatment can become blurred. A phrase like breakthrough can travel faster than caution. A headline can become more memorable than the unanswered questions behind it. But inside Karolinska, some people began to feel that the story being told publicly did not match the reality they were seeing. 4 doctors at Karolinska University Hospital would later become central whistleblowers: Karl-Henrik Grinnemer, Matthias Korbastia, Thomas Fuchs, and Oskar Simonsen. They were not outsiders attacking from a distance. They were clinicians and researchers close enough to see records, outcomes, and discrepancies. They raised concerns that research publications describe the patient's post-operative conditions and the function of the implants in ways that were too positive and not consistent with what had actually happened. That distinction matters. Medicine depends on accurate reporting. A scientific paper is not only a record of the past, it becomes a guide for future decisions. If a paper says a patient is doing well when the clinical reality is far more serious, then the paper does more than mislead readers. It can help justify the next procedure. It can help keep a dangerous idea alive. By 2014, concerns about Macchiarini's work had moved from private unease into formal complaints. But the system did not respond simply. And this is where the case becomes larger than one doctor. It becomes a story about hierarchy, prestige, and the slow, uncomfortable work of telling the truth when powerful institutions are not ready to hear it. In ordinary language, we often think of a crime as something sudden, a door forced open, a weapon, a nighttime call, a disappearance. This case does not look like that. It unfolded beneath bright surgical lights in respected institutions, with consent forms, published papers, and professional titles. It was surrounded by the language of care. That is what makes it so unsettling. The crime, as later judged by a Swedish appeals court, concerned 3 synthetic trachea transplant operations performed at Karolinska University Hospital. The legal question was not simply whether the operations failed. In medicine, even careful treatment can fail. Patients can die despite skilled and ethical care. Surgeons often work in uncertainty, especially when cases are severe. The harder question was whether these procedures were medically justified at all. Were they treatment? Were they research? Were they supported by sufficient evidence? Were the risks understood and honestly communicated? And when the procedures were performed, were they consistent with science and proven experience? Or did they cross a line into unlawful harm? The synthetic trachea implants were intended to become functional airways. But according to later investigations and findings, there were serious problems with the underlying evidence, the ethical approvals, the reporting, and the way patient outcomes were represented. To understand the gravity, it helps to slow down and imagine the basic medical reality. The trachea is not just a tube. It is living tissue. It must remain open under pressure. It must resist infection. It must integrate with surrounding structures. It must move with the body. It must allow air to pass minute after minute, day after day, without collapsing, narrowing, eroding, or becoming a source of constant injury. Replacing it with an artificial structure was not like replacing a simple mechanical part. The body is not a machine in that way. For the synthetic trachea concept to be safe, there needed to be strong evidence that the scaffold could work inside a human body. There needed to be careful animal studies. There needed to be ethical approval and transparent reporting. There needed to be honest descriptions of what happened to earlier patients, but the image presented to the world was often brighter than the reality. Mariam Bayene's operation in 2011 was celebrated as a world first. The story was powerful. A custom-made synthetic windpipe, created with advanced technology and seeded with cells, implanted in a man with cancer. It seemed to mark the beginning of a new era. But Bayene later suffered severe complications. He died in 2014. Chris Lyles underwent surgery in 2011. He died months later. Yesim Setir underwent surgery in 2012 and suffered terribly afterward. Her condition required prolonged treatment and additional procedures. She died in 2017. The deaths themselves were not automatically criminal findings. These patients had serious medical conditions. But the court later assessed Macchiarini's actions in relation to the operations and concluded that they amounted to serious assault in 3 cases. That judgment came after years of investigation, criticism, and legal proceedings. In 2022, a lower Swedish court convicted Macchiarini of causing bodily harm in 1 case, but gave him a suspended sentence. Prosecutors appealed. In June 2023, the Svea Court of Appeal reached a much stronger conclusion, finding him guilty of 3 cases of aggravated or serious assault and sentencing him to 2 years and 6 months in prison. In October 2023, Sweden's Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal, which meant the appeals court judgment stood. The language is stark. A surgeon, once celebrated as a pioneer, legally judged to have committed serious assault through medical interventions. That is not a familiar kind of true crime story. But it is true crime all the same, because the essence of the case is trust. Patients trusted that a doctor offering experimental treatment would still be bound by careful evidence and ethical limits. Families trusted that a famous hospital would not allow prestige to outrun safety. Readers of medical journals trusted that the published record reflected what had truly happened. And colleagues trusted that when they raised alarms, the institution would listen. In each of those areas, the case revealed deep failure. The public image of Macchiarini also involved another layer of deception, separate from the surgical cases, but important to understanding how he moved through the world. In 2016, Vanity Fair published the story of Benita Alexander, a television producer who had worked on a documentary involving Macchiarini and later became personally involved with him. She said he told elaborate lies about his life and their planned wedding, including claims involving world leaders and the Pope. Those claims were not part of the Swedish assault conviction, but they shaped public understanding of his pattern of deception. This part of the story can easily become sensational, and we will not linger on it for drama. Its importance is quieter. It showed how charisma can operate beyond the operating room. It showed how convincingly a person can construct a world around themselves, using confidence, status, and intimacy to make unlikely claims feel possible. When the personal revelations emerged, they did not create the medical scandal. The medical concerns had already been raised by doctors and researchers. But the personal story drew public attention. It opened a door through which wider scrutiny entered. Soon, the story that had once been about a medical miracle became something else entirely. It became a scandal of science, medicine, and institutional failure. The investigation did not begin with a single dramatic discovery. It began with people noticing that things did not add up. In 2014, a Belgian researcher submitted a complaint to Karolinska Institutet accusing Macchiarini of scientific misconduct. Around the same time, the 4 Karolinska doctors raised concerns about 7 scientific papers. They argued that the published articles made the patient's conditions and the implant's function appear better than they were. This was a serious allegation. In medical research, the written record matters profoundly. A paper can influence surgeons in other countries. It can shape funding decisions. It can affect whether ethics boards approve future work. It can persuade desperate patients that a procedure is more established than it really is. Karolinska assigned an external reviewer, Bengt Gerdin, a professor emeritus at Uppsala University, to examine the material. In 2015, Gerdin concluded that Macchiarini had been guilty of misconduct in research in the articles he reviewed. That could have been a turning point, but it was not. At least, not yet. Karolinska's leadership cleared Macchiarini of scientific misconduct in 2015, while also saying his research did not meet the standards of quality expected by the university and scientific community. The distinction was difficult for many observers to understand. The external reviewer had found misconduct. The institution chose not to uphold that conclusion. For the whistleblowers, the cost was high. They had raised concerns about patient safety and scientific accuracy, but they faced professional pressure. In many institutional scandals, this is the quiet middle chapter, the period when those warning of harm are treated as the problem, while the person at the center remains protected by status. Then came January 2016. Swedish television broadcast a 3-part documentary called The Experiment. It showed patients and outcomes in a way that the public could no longer ignore. The documentary raised urgent questions about whether patients had suffered and died after procedures that were not adequately supported by evidence. Around the same time, Vanity Fair published allegations that Macchiarini had lied about parts of his resume and personal life. The combined effect was enormous. Karolinska Institutet entered a crisis. In February 2016, the Vice-Chancellor, Anders Hamsten, resigned. Karolinska reopened misconduct inquiries. The institution began reviewing how Macchiarini had been recruited and why his contract had been extended. In March 2016, Macchiarini was dismissed from his position at Karolinska. But even his dismissal did not close the matter. A broader external investigation, led by Sten Heckscher, examined Karolinska's handling of the case. The findings were deeply critical. The investigation pointed to failures in recruitment, contract extensions, oversight, and the handling of misconduct allegations. It described an institution that had not properly followed rules and had not adequately responded to warning signs. This is one of the most important lessons of the case. A scandal like this does not require every person in an institution to act with bad intent. Often, it grows through a series of smaller failures. Someone assumes another office has checked the details. Someone believes the famous expert. Someone is reluctant to challenge a celebrated recruit. Someone decides that negative information is not quite enough to stop the momentum. And step by step, the safeguards weaken. There were also scientific consequences. Articles connected to Macchiarini's work came under renewed scrutiny. Some were retracted, others were found to involve misconduct. Karolinska requested retractions for multiple papers. The Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals, later retracted 2 papers related to trachea transplant work after Swedish findings concluded that the articles contained falsified information. Retractions are not just administrative corrections. They are part of how science tries to repair the record. But in medicine, a delayed correction can arrive after real harm has already occurred. A retraction cannot give patients back their years, their health, or their trust. It can only mark the paper as unreliable and warn future readers not to build on it. The criminal investigation moved more slowly. Swedish prosecutors examined whether Macchiarini's actions could amount to criminal harm. At one point, he was investigated on suspicion of serious crimes, including causing death, though the legal path changed over time. The difficulty was partly that the patients were seriously ill, and criminal law requires proof of specific elements. It is one thing to say a procedure was unethical or scientifically unsupported. It is another to prove, in court, that a doctor's actions meet the legal definition of assault or another crime. In 2022, The Solna District Court convicted Macchiarini of causing bodily harm in one case and acquitted him of other assault charges. The sentence was suspended. For many who had followed the case, that outcome felt limited. Prosecutors appealed. In June 2023, the Svea Court of Appeal delivered a stronger judgment. It found Macchiarini guilty of 3 cases of serious assault and sentenced him to 2 years and 6 months in prison. The court concluded that the interventions were not consistent with science and proven experience. In October 2023, Sweden's Supreme Court declined leave to appeal. That meant the appeals court ruling stood. The legal case had reached its final Swedish stage. Still, the investigation in a broader moral sense did not end there. Because after the court judgment, there remained a larger question for medicine and research. How did so many systems fail at once? The answer is not simple. Part of it was the power of hope. Regenerative medicine offered a beautiful vision, and many people wanted that vision to be real. Part of it was institutional prestige. Karolinska had recruited someone presented as a star. Once an institution invests its reputation in a person, admitting error can feel like damaging itself. Part of it was the difficulty of challenging authority. Surgeons often work in hierarchical environments. Junior colleagues, nurses, and researchers may see warning signs, but fear professional consequences. Part of it was the pressure of scientific competition. A world first can bring fame, funding, and influence. In that climate, caution can be mistaken for lack of imagination. And part of it was Macchiarini himself, his confidence, his public image, and his ability to tell a compelling story made him unusually persuasive. But the case also shows the importance of people who refused to stop asking questions. The whistleblowers did not have the easier path. They faced stress and backlash. Yet their concerns helped expose the gap between published claims and clinical reality. Journalists and documentary makers helped bring the story to public attention. External reviewers and later misconduct boards helped correct parts of the scientific record. Prosecutors pursued a legal case that eventually resulted in a prison sentence. The truth moved slowly. But it moved. To understand why this case continues to disturb people, we need to sit with the setting. This was not a backroom clinic. This was elite medicine. The procedures were associated with famous institutions, published in respected journals, and described with the language of innovation. That is what made the warning signs harder for the public to see. Most of us are not equipped to evaluate an experimental trachea transplant. We cannot read a surgical plan and know whether the scaffold has been properly tested. We cannot look at cell seeding methods and understand whether the result is likely to become living tissue. We rely on systems, hospitals, ethics boards, universities, journals, licensing bodies, peer review. In the Macchiarini case, those systems did not act quickly enough. And that creates a particular kind of fear, not fear of a stranger in the dark. Fear of a trusted room. Fear of a white coat. A conference stage. A published article. A prestigious name. There is a reason the story has been retold in documentaries, podcasts, and dramatized television. It unsettles people because it reverses the expected shape of danger. The operating room is supposed to be one of the most controlled environments in human life. Everything is measured. Everything is sterile. Everyone has a role. Every instrument is counted. And yet, control is not only about clean surfaces and surgical skill. It is also about truth. If the evidence is weak, if the risks are minimized, if outcomes are overstated, then the room can appear controlled, while the deeper safeguards are already failing. This is why research ethics exist. They can sound bureaucratic from the outside. Committees, approvals, protocols, consent processes, adverse event reporting, data monitoring, conflict of interest disclosures. But these are not mere formalities. They are the quiet architecture built around vulnerable people. A patient facing a frightening diagnosis may not feel free in the way an ordinary consumer feels free. They may consent because the alternative is death or severe suffering. They may trust a doctor's confidence because they have no way to independently measure the evidence. They may hear experimental and understand risk, but not understand how little is actually known. True consent requires more than a signature. It requires honesty. It requires that hope not be used as pressure. It requires that the doctor remember the patient's vulnerability and not mistake desperation for permission. The Macchiarini case shows how easily the language of compassion can become entangled with ambition. A surgeon may say, "There is no other option." A hospital may say, "This is innovative care." A paper may say, "The patient is recovering." A press release may say, "A breakthrough." Each sentence may sound plausible on its own. Together, they can create a story so powerful that contrary evidence struggles to be heard. In the years after the scandal broke, Karolinska made changes to procedures involving recruitment, ethics, and misconduct handling. The case became a cautionary example in discussions of medical research integrity. But the warning extends beyond one institution. Every field that rewards novelty must also protect skepticism. Every institution that celebrates genius must also make room for ordinary questions. Can we see the data? What happened to the patient after the cameras left? Were complications reported honestly? Who benefits from calling this a success? Who is being ignored? These questions may not sound dramatic, but they are life-saving questions. And in this story, the people who asked them became essential. By the end, the story of Paolo Macchiarini had changed shape completely. The celebrated surgeon became a convicted criminal. The miracle operations became evidence in a case about serious assault. The scientific papers that once helped build the legend became subjects of misconduct findings and retractions. The institution that had elevated him was forced to examine its own failures, and the patients, whose hopes had been tied to the promise of a new medical future, became the human center of a warning the world could not ignore. There is no comfort in pretending this story is simple. It is not only about one deceptive doctor. It is also about the systems that praised him, protected him, published him, and hesitated too long when others raised alarms. It is about the fragile boundary between innovation and experimentation on human beings, It is about the way hope can be both necessary and dangerous. And it is about the quiet courage required to say, even inside a famous institution, even when the room is full of important people, that something is wrong. For the families of Andemariam Bayen, Chris Lyles, Yesim Keter, Hannah Warren, and others touched by these procedures. The story is not an abstract lesson. It is personal. It is loss. It is the memory of decisions made in moments when every option felt heavy. For medicine, the case remains a warning. Progress matters. Research matters. Bold ideas matter. But no vision of the future should be allowed to outrun the duty owed to the person lying in the hospital bed today. That duty is not glamorous. It does not always make headlines. It asks for patience, humility, documentation, doubt, and care. It asks doctors to remember that a patient is never a proof of concept. A patient is a life. And in the quiet after this story, that may be the sentence worth carrying with us. Not as fear, but as a safeguard. A reminder that truth in medicine is not an obstacle to hope. It is the only ground on which hope can safely stand. Thank you for listening. Tonight's story was a difficult one, but it was also a story about the importance of questions, transparency, and the people who speak up when something feels wrong. As you rest, let the details soften now. The hospitals, the courtrooms, the headlines, and the long investigations can fade into the background. What remains is a quieter thought. Care must be careful. Hope must be honest. And even in the most advanced rooms in the world, the simplest duty still matters most. Good night.